The king of pop trembles uncontrollably in a luxury suite at Beverly Hills. Michael Jackson, the global icon, frantically calls his manager at 3 a.m., panic in his voice. "They own me," he whispers, eyes darting around the room as if invisible cameras are watching. In his shaking hands, a contract with clauses that read like modern slavery. He's not the master of his empire, he's its prisoner. On the nightstand, a collection of pills prescribed by doctors on his label's payroll keeps him docile, dependent, and performing when his body begs to collapse. This isn't just another celebrity meltdown. It's the moment when America's greatest entertainment product realizes he isn't the artist anymore. He's the canvas, painted by those who profit from his distorted image. The real Michael Jackson was never the person you thought you knew. You felt that opening like a cold room closing behind you. That scene furious phone calls in the middle of the night. Contracts that read like shackles doesn't appear in the story most people were taught. Now the camera pulls back. We will rehearse the public version everyone learned. The tidy, triumphant myth that made Michael Jackson safe to love. Imagine a classroom with a poster of a smiling boy in a suit. The teacher speaks with a steady, practiced voice. From Gary, Indiana, to the world stage, Michael Jackson rose through talent and hard work. A documentary narrator, warm and measured in tones. A child prodigy, a cultural icon, a philanthropist. These are the voices of the official story, rounded, confident, untroubled. "He healed the world," says one polished line in a museum exhibit. "His music brought us together," says another, in a film clip that never lingers on messy details. The fairy tale is compelling because it is simple. It begins on a suburban Midwestern street. A large family, a strict father, a small boy who sings with impossible rhythm. In the public telling, Joe Jackson is a tough coach, not an abuser. Motown's Berry Gordy is the benevolent discoverer. The child becomes the prodigy, and the prodigy becomes a global solo star. Off the Wall, Thriller, Bad, each title is rendered almost as sacred text. Thriller becomes a milestone in both commerce and pop artistry. The story speeds forward on hit singles, groundbreaking videos, moonwalks that look like miracles, award shows that confirm destiny. Picture the montage: neon lights, glitter, the shock of sequins under stage spotlights. The narrator explains how Jackson rewrote expectations. Music videos became short films, choreography became language. You see him in rehearsal rooms, obsessively working, a white glove contrasted against a piano. These are the images the official story traffics in. Genius as singular devotion. It is tidy because it assigns moral clarity to creative work. It tells us that brilliance excuses eccentricity. It frames eccentricity as the cost of genius. The second act of the canonical tale is moral and emotional. Jackson is not merely successful, he is saintly. His charitable acts, donations to hospitals, visits to sick children, public appeals for unity are pressed forward as evidence of a soul larger than himself. Close-up footage of him with children, soft smiles and gentle hands, is cut into television specials. A voiceover intones, he used his fame for good. The imagery is persuasive. A man surrounded by children becomes an argument against accusation. The public story leans into this because it solves a problem: how to reconcile odd behavior with an otherwise beautiful legacy. Charity becomes both defense and branding. When trouble appears in that neat narrative, when plastic surgery, reclusive behavior, or accusations surge like ripples, the official line is trained to absorb and deflect. Plastic surgery is framed medically. Vitiligo is introduced as explanation. A few cosmetic tweaks become a personal health issue or a private preference. Eccentric behavior is romanticized as harmless whimsy. Accusations are reframed as the price paid by a luminous man attacked by tabloids and opportunists. Victim of a media feeding frenzy, runs the standard clause. The public-facing story offers a single, Comforting answer. The artist was misunderstood. Listen to the chorus of voices that enforce that reading. A well-crafted tribute documentary plays a montage of celebrity endorsements. Michael was a brother, a father, an artist. A reverend appears in 1990s television footage and says, with quiet gravity, his heart was for children. A record executive, speaking to a camera with rehearsed sympathy, offers, he gave us the soundtrack of our lives. Those lines are not neutral. They are part of a choreography. When pressure builds, influential people step forward to stabilize value. This is how narratives are ensured. This version does something crucial. It translates complexity into merchandise. A sanitized Michael is easier to license, to tour, to celebrate in anniversary albums and Las Vegas residencies. Museums can make exhibits that avoid legal thickets. Studios can package this as it footage into a triumphant final bow. A tidy story is profitable. It cleans the edges of ambiguity so the commodity can be sold without the friction of moral debate. The tale comforts because it closes unsettling questions. Now imagine a map on screen. Pins appear at Gary, Indiana, Motown offices in Detroit, Los Angeles studios, Neverland Ranch in Santa Barbara County. At each pin, the museum-quality narrative pauses: discovery, ascent, reinvention, retreat. The map tells a convenient geography for a myth. It leaves out the crooked alleys, the contracts signed under pressure, the internal memos, the settlements. In the official cartography, those darker routes are absent because they complicate the flow of a story meant to be consumed wholesale. Who benefits from this version? The answer is obvious if you hold the image like a ledger. Record labels cash in. Publishing houses write biographies. Estates monetize archival footage, sometimes earning more posthumously than during the artist's life. Corporations that own catalogs, companies with legal teams and PR budgets have a stake in a single, valuable Michael. Cultural institutions, longing for blockbuster attendance, curate comfortable exhibits. Fans get a comforting figure to mourn. Industries get predictable returns. This alignment of interests is not conspiratorial. It is mundane and efficient. But efficiency creates an incentive to control the narrative. The official storytellers are many. PR firms, record executives, apologists, sympathetic clergy, and celebrity friends. Each has its script. PR teams coach interviews. Publicists set conditions for access. Allies provide sound bites that humanize. Powerful journalists are offered exclusives in exchange for framing. The pieces move with choreography. A supportive sermon here, an authorized TV special there, a filmed rehearsal released at exactly the moment public attention needs redirection. The tactics are subtle, not theatrical. They are the quiet moves of craft that produce impression rather than truth. Consider the polished interview clip that became part of the rehabilitation cycle. A composed Michael speaks of love and healing. The camera lingers on sincere eyes, and the edit removes awkward pauses. The message arrives clean. He is devoted to children. He is a misunderstood paragon. That moment is a technique, not revelation. It is engineered to close a gap between accusation and exoneration in public perception. Now, drop into a gallery of official voices. A museum audio guide in tones. Jackson's artistry transcended race and era. A children's charity commercial played back to back with a tribute montage says, he gave to those who needed it most. A late-night host, smiling, jokes about eccentric details and then ends with praise. Each utterance smooths the rough edges. Together, they produce a societal lullaby. Sleep, the story says, do not look too closely. Yet this is not to say the official story is purely invention. Much of it rests on unassailable facts, musical breakthroughs, chart records, philanthropic gifts. The danger lies in selection: what is shown, how it is framed, and what is silenced. The myth selects heroic notes and omits the dissonance that makes the truth messy. That selection is a political act, because it shapes myth, and where there is cover, there are always people working under it. What those people did, who they were, and why they chose to protect a particular image will be the next thing we pull into the light. Before we move on, a short note from the makers of this investigation. Thank you for watching this careful work so far. If you believe stories should be scrutinized and not sold whole, consider subscribing. This channel is new, and every subscription helps us investigate more histories your school books avoided, and helps reach the 1,000 subscribers we need to grow. Join us, and bring others who still prefer questions over comforting finales. The polished tale begins to show fine hairline fractures when confronted with primary documents and unsparing timelines. Start, for a moment, with the earliest image, a child on stage in Gary, Indiana. In the classroom version, the discipline of Joe Jackson is a kind of boot camp that produced excellence. But read the interviews Joe later gave, and the admission is blunt. Physical discipline was routine, described in language that sits disturbingly close to abuse. The contradiction is simple. The same childhood is cited as both the engine of genius and the wound that never healed. Which is it? Or more precisely, how was one narrative made to serve both accounts at once? Begin with chronology. The official story compresses decades into a sequence that reads like inevitability. The truth on the ground is messier. Medical accounts, photographs, and contemporaneous reports reveal a timeline of physical change for Michael Jackson that precedes the public diagnosis of vitiligo. Early photographs from the late 1970s show subtle but progressive alteration of facial contours, nose bridges narrowed, cheekbones refined. Medical experts, consulted after the fact, identified multiple procedural interventions across different decades. The official line vitiligo and a few minor procedures meets a string of clinical evidence that suggests a pattern of cosmetic surgery long before the public was told the full story. Now the financial contradictions. You learned in the tidy version that a global pop monarch would span a gilded throne of earnings. Yet court records and bankruptcy filings tell another story. Recurrent cash crises, leveraged assets, loans secured against future royalties. How does the world's best-selling pop artist repeatedly face near insolvency? Look at contracts. Deals that ceded publishing rights, royalty structures that favored labels and managers, and personal spending that outpaced income. Real estate, staff, security, and an ever-expanding private zoo. The dissonance is not merely about personal extravagance. It is structural. Legal architecture's contracts with artists' rights inserted into corporate portfolios created mechanisms where profits accrued to powerful intermediaries long before the artist ever saw the cash. So the myth of wealth becomes a mask for a more ordinary truth. Artists can be the engines of wealth, while corporations capture the value. Then there is the hardest, most combustible set of inconsistencies: Michael Jackson's relationships with children. The official narrative cultivated since the 1980s had two moves: present Jackson as child-friendly and saintly when accusations arose, offer legal victories as vindication. But the record is littered with payments, settlements, anecdotal reports, and recurring patterns that refuse the tidy explanation of innocence by legal outcome. Begin with the pattern. Friends, guests, and staff consistently described a social architecture at Neverland and in Jackson's touring life that provided boys with unusual access: private rooms, late-night visits, and an adult host who cultivated domestic intimacy. Some parents welcomed this, seeing proximity to fame as an investment. Others were later plaintiffs. Public defenders point to legal acquittals and settlements structured as civil resolutions, not admissions of guilt. That is technically true, but it misses a crucial point. Settlements and non-disclosure agreements are not neutral evidence of innocence. They are tools, mechanisms that silence and rearrange evidence, that buy time and deflect public attention. Look at the most notorious moment: August 1993. The allegation from the Chandler family precipitated a criminal investigation and a public raid at Neverland. Photographs were taken. Investigators cataloged rooms, security systems, and personal items. A witness described distinctive markings. The implication led detectives to seek physical evidence. Then a settlement reported variously as $15 to $23 million arrived. The settlement occurred just before potential testimony under oath, truncating a legal path that might have produced public testimony. That sequence: accusation, investigation, settlement, collapse of criminal proceedings repeats a pattern that privileges silence over fact-finding. For the public story, the settlement becomes a tidy end. The celebrity is spared the ordeal of trial. For the investigative record, the settlement raises the question of what was not allowed to be asked under oath. The contradiction deepens when we examine the actors who engineered these resolutions. Lawyers, insurers, and publicists engaged in a calculus. Pay a sum to avoid criminal jeopardy and the financial uncertainty of drawn-out litigation. That calculus does not equal innocence or guilt. It equals risk management. But risk management, when performed by institutions with more resources than a single family, creates a moral asymmetry. It gives wealth the option to convert legal jeopardy into contractual silence. That asymmetry is central to the cracks in the official narrative, a sanitized image constructed by expedience and financial muscle. Then there are the oddities of social normalization. The entertainment machine that promoted Jackson's childlike persona simultaneously produced justifications for his behavior that would never be extended to other adults. Intimacy with children was framed as mentoring, an expression of spiritual innocence, or the eccentricity of genius. Parents who allowed their children access often received gifts and opportunities in tangible currencies that blurred lines between consent and acquiescence. The narrative work here was twofold: to sanctify the host and to normalize parental choices that, in another context, would draw alarm. That normalization had consequences beyond one household. It subtly shifted cultural perceptions about acceptable adult-child relationships. Another thread runs through these contradictions: the handling of medical narratives. Publicly, vitiligo became a medical explanation for changing skin tone. Privately, medical records and accounts suggest a more complex interplay: multiple dermatological treatments, potential skin lightening procedures, and a suite of cosmetic surgeries aimed at altering racialized features. The official story emphasizes disease. Other records point to elective alteration motivated by insecurity and image control. That tension is not merely cosmetic. It speaks to identity politics and the painful pressures faced by an artist who inhabited multiple racial and cultural spaces while being marketed globally to a predominantly white industry and audience. We must also attend to the machinery of image maintenance. Sony and other corporate entities had enormous financial stakes in the artist's catalog. Internal memos, when they surface, show strategy memos that read like corporate crisis playbooks. The moves are familiar: recruit sympathetic clergy, buy friendly coverage, stage feel-good appearances, and craft exclusive access. The difference in this case is scale. The assets at risk: catalog royalties, endorsements, touring revenue amount to sums so large they change national conversations about liability and reputation. When the money at stake is measured in tens of millions or more, the incentive to manage perception becomes institutionalized. Now drop into the archival imagery of that era. You see a press release being drafted in a corporate office. A publicist circles phrasing: no comment regarding ongoing litigation. A religious leader is telephoned and asked to speak at a benefit. A friendly reporter is offered an exclusive interview contingent on context and sensitivity. These are mundane actions, but look at them in sequence. They form a choreography whose result is a public memory sculpted less by unsparing truth than by managed impression. That choreography is not a conspiracy of evil masterminds. It is the predictable coordination of actors with compatible interests. Equally revealing are the absences. Some names are conspicuously quiet in mainstream memorials. What do we make of the settlements, the silence, the deferred testimony, and the cultivated images? We should not leap from these evidentiary fragments to the certainty of monstrous guilt. Legal outcomes in the American system are often contingent, messy, and subject to strategic choices. But neither should we allow the soothing balm of official narratives to anesthetize critical inquiry. The presence of repeatedly similar patterns, payments that avoid trials, PR choreographies that redirect attention, charitable acts deployed as shields creates a credible basis to demand fuller transparency rather than acceptance of official soundbites. Consider also the human costs hidden behind contracts and press releases. Victims and accusers, people whose lives were altered, often enter a legal and social fight that is unequal. Non-disclosure agreements and settlements can prevent them from speaking, healing in public, or confronting what happened. The corporate machinery that preserves lucrative images does so sometimes at the cost of silencing painful testimony. That trade-off is a moral decision disguised as an administrative one. Finally, listen to the quiet testimonies of those who worked in the orbit. A former aide recalls doors closed when questions were asked. A chauffeur remembers being warned about discussing certain guests. A staffer speaks of a culture that normalized secrecy. These voices, small and at times contradictory, collectively push toward a conclusion. The official Michael that the world learned to love was the product of choices made by many, choices that optimized for marketability and legal safety over truth-telling. Mini cliffhanger. The contradictions we have just traced are not mere curiosities. They are the fingerprints of a wider apparatus that smoothed rough edges for profit and protection. If the myth was made to sell, someone had to design the molds. What followed behind closed doors, in boardrooms and private negotiation rooms, was the active work of manufacturing consent. Next, we will step into those rooms, the late-night strategy sessions, the legal calculations, and the moral compromises that kept the myth afloat even as evidence piled up. Behind the glove, the camera moves into narrow hallways and glass conference rooms where the public Michael was quietly reassembled. The scene is not a stage but a series of back offices. A mahogany table with a half-empty bottle of bourbon, a legal pad with terse bullet points, a private jet manifest with names circled in red. It is late. Fluorescent lights hum. People in suits pass envelopes and sharpen phrases until they sound like absolution. You are shown a rehearsal, not of choreography, but of language. A publicist taps a pen and asks, "How do we make him smaller, less dangerous, more lovable?" A lawyer draws a red line through the words allegation and replaces it with nuisance claim. An executive files an internal memo, catalog valuation, projected royalties, cash cushion required to preserve stock price. The decisions are banal calendars, budgets, talking points, but the effect is monumental. They are building scaffolding around a story and then painting over the scaffolding with sentiment. In the center of these rooms sits Michael, both subject and tool. He arrives with moods, requests, and an intimacy that must be engineered. He is briefed, coached, made ready to perform empathy for cameras. Former aides remember how he studied interviews like a role. Canted head, measured laugh, eyes held long enough to create trust. In private, though, he is described as needy and imperious. He wanted control of how the world read him. He also relied on confidence to arrange the world he lived in. That double dependence on image and on handlers produced a choreography in which he danced to survive and others danced to profit. The enablers are diverse and constant. Doctors, sometimes credentialed, sometimes shadowy, keep lists of prescriptions and quiet telephone lines. They are the ones who provide relief and render dependency. A house physician speaks softly into night calls. A nurse brings trays and removes questions. Security teams learn more than the schedule. They learn whom to keep at arm's length, whom to escort in, when to shut a door gently, and when to slam it. House managers manage not only supplies, but silhouettes: who sleeps where, who leaves before dawn, who signs confidentiality agreements. There are suppliers of a different kind, companions. Staff were sometimes charged with creating pools of children who might be invited to Neverland or a hotel suite. Parents' motivations varied. Some saw proximity to fame as an opportunity for their child. Others sought financial help. Gifts were distributed. Checks, tickets, introductions. Those gifts were currencies that blurred consent. A parent offered free labor may grow dependent on the favors that opened doors for their child. The moral calculus is ugly and ordinary. Someone with access to capital can reshape decisions that in another context would be unthinkable. Record executives occupy a strange middle ground. On camera, they are poetic about genius. Off camera, they are precise about balance sheets. Internal correspondences, when released later, read like risk assessments. How many negative stories will the market tolerate, and at what cost? They weigh the hit to reputation against projected profit from a reissued album, a soundtrack, a remix. They talk in quarter terms, projections for 12 months, 24 months. This is business speak as armor. Friends and confidants were not immune. The social ecosystem around Michael was intensely volatile. Loyalty and silence were prized. Those who asked questions about overnight guests, about off-the-record payments, about unusual schedules were gradually edged out. The pattern is the same in many powerful enclaves. Critics are exiled, allies promoted, curiosity bought or stifled. The result was an orbit in which contradictions could persist with little scrutiny. Negotiations after allegations are described in clinical terms: calls, drafts, NDAs, but the choreography contains moral geometry. Lawyers calculate exposure and propose a settlement figure, not in the spirit of reconciliation, but as a way to convert juridical risk into a financial number easily digestible by insurers and committees. Insurers are risk models personified. They ask how likely a claim is to reach trial and how much negative publicity would depress the catalog's future earnings. The answer becomes a monetary instrument. Pay X to silence Y, thereby preserving Z millions in future revenue. Money becomes the eraser. The erasures are one of the most revealing features of the backstage world. Documents are redacted, names scrubbed, photographs sequestered. When historians later comb through archives, they find stacks of sticky notes. Do not publish. A former archivist recounts boxes labeled personal. Another remembers a cabinet whose key was rarely used. The selective preservation of memory is a quiet act of power. It decides which evidence is allowed to shape public understanding. This ecosystem, doctors, security, parents, record executives, lawyers, creates a protected bubble. Inside it, routines replace institutions. A Queen's Court of Advisors convenes daily to make what amount to small compromises. Adjust the schedule, move the press conference, authorize a gift, sign a check. Each small compromise accumulates into a pattern that shields and isolates. But patterns create pressure points. Small concessions like paying for discretion or reshuffling invitations pile up into structural choices that favor containment over truth. When containment becomes the default, the system's logic changes. It no longer seeks justice or care. It seeks continuity. Continuity for the brand, continuity for the assets, continuity for the people whose livelihoods depend on the brand's survival. That shift from care to continuity is the moral pivot of the backstage story. There are human costs. Former staffers tell of being coached to avoid conversations that could protect a child. There are tales of late-night admonitions and whispered warnings. Do not mention that. There are stories of people who left with their reputations gouged by legal pressure, who signed NDAs and were then described, publicly, as unreliable. The machinery does not only preserve an image, it preserves the mechanisms by which the image is manufactured, at times sacrificing truth and human well-being to do so. One former aide's line reverberates. There were always two Michaels, the one created for public consumption and the real person who lived in a world where... So the strategy is to anticipate, to redirect narratives, to recruit powerful allies, to create buffers, religious endorsements, celebrity testimonials, televised charity events. They build an alibi of goodness around the man. The choreography is meticulous. Declare philanthropy, stage a visit, give a speech about children, and the optics shift. The public breathes easier. But optics are not the same as truth. The machines that manufacture optics also manufacture silence. The people who profit have incentives to keep it that way. And where incentives align in secret, the world that gets produced on the outside will often be a polished artifact, not a faithful record. Mini cliffhanger. The backstage smooth friction into continuity until August 1993. The next scene we enter is a raid. Cameras, officers, flashbulbs, and a resident world suddenly exposed in daylight. What happened when the neat choreography of management met the messy work of criminal investigation will change everything, or so one would expect. The thing is, institutions are resilient in different ways. The public record shows one version. The private files tell another. What unfolded next will reveal how deep the protections ran, and how far those protections went to keep the story intact. The morning the investigators arrived, Neverland was a photograph. Manicured lawns, white fences, a carousel frozen between turns. The ranch had been designed as a fairground of adult nostalgia, a place for children to be children, as the public was told. But a closer camera now shows corridors, bedrooms, private elevators, places where the guest list and the schedule were controlled with near military precision. Police moved through rooms with numbered evidence bags, flashbulbs stuttering like a staccato drum roll. They cataloged toys, pajamas, photographs, and a store of objects that in a different context were charming. The investigation was forensic and clinical. A detective remembers the scent of the room cleaning solvents, the faint sweet trace of a bakery item left on a side table. Police notes describe a bedroom with a theme, multiple locks, and a sense of staging. These were not opinions. These were recorded observations in a log that would later be cited and parsed. The allegation was specific in a way that demanded more than gossip. A father named details about marks, about behavior, about timing. Investigators took it seriously. They sought physical confirmation. The Chandler complaint was the kind of charge that, if corroborated, could carry criminal consequences heavy enough to fracture a legacy. But legal processes have their own rhythms, and those rhythms can be altered with sufficient resources. The sequence that followed was a study in legal strategy. Lawyers moved quickly to reframe the calculus. Settlements were discussed, sums proposed. Insurers reviewed exposure models. The parties negotiated not because evidence was thin, it may or may not have been, but because institutions prefer certainty over risk. Certainty could be purchased. The payment reported in the press was staggering to the public. Figures quoted at $15, $23 million in various outlets. For anyone not fluent in litigation finance, that is a shape-shifting number. For those in the industry, it was a mechanism. A settlement buys silence, and, crucially, it interrupts the evidentiary trajectory. A witness released from the obligation to testify under oath denies prosecutors and the public the chance to hear those accounts in a courtroom under penalty of perjury. Why does that matter? Because testimony under oath becomes part of the permanent record. It can be cross-examined, entered, and made visible to jurors and historians alike. A settlement forecloses that possibility. It converts a contested narrative into a contractual confidentiality clause. The trade-off is legal finality for evidentiary opacity. That trade-off is not the same as innocence. It is risk management. Yet watch how risk management is presented publicly. A carefully worded press release becomes a hinge. The settlement was for closure and to avoid the emotional strain of litigation. The public hears closure. The insiders hear prevent testimony. Which reading is true? Both can be. In either case, the spotlight shifts away from adjudicating a claim to managing fallout. The criminal investigation, deprived of its central witness and now contending with a chorus of PR, lost momentum. Investigators were left with photographs, interviews, and an investigator's sense of unease. Prosecutors weigh evidence and likelihood of conviction. The absence of direct testimony often makes a case infeasible. Charges were not brought in that cycle. That legal result, no indictment, was then claimed as vindication in the court of public opinion. It is an easy narrative to sell. The state did not charge, therefore the claim was false. That gloss is simplistic because it ignores the structural mechanisms that preceded the absence of charges. In the hours and days after the settlement, another kind of calculus took place. The public relations script was activated. The goal: replace suspicion with sympathy. The playbook read like a small manual in media relations: recruit moral authorities, mobilize celebrity solidarity, flood the market with sanitized images of charity and warmth. A minister writes a letter praising the man's devotion to children. Friends record-taped endorsements. A video of him visiting a hospital is released on loop. These moves are both authentic and strategic. Their authenticity complicates, not absolves, the purpose. There were other immediate ripples. In 1994, a hastily publicized marriage to Lisa Marie Presley, widely interpreted in the press as a romantic drama, also functioned as image surgery. Weddings have historically served as powerful symbolism in celebrity rehabilitation. They humanize, they domesticize, they suggest normalcy. Whether the marriage was motivated by genuine affection, by a desire for public validation, or by strategic image-making is disputed among insiders. What is clear is that it had instantaneous effect on public conversation. Tabloids shifted tones, commentators speculated about love-conquering scandal, and a portion of the audience recalibrated their judgment. There were quieter coercions in the periphery. Potential witnesses were contacted. Lawyers wrote letters reminding people about the dangers of defamation. Some families accepted payments. Others refused and later described the pressure as corrosive. Remember, settlements do not occur in a vacuum. They are negotiated in an environment thick with power imbalances. A family with few resources faces different incentives than a corporation with a team of counsel and insurers. This is also where media relationships harden into power. Friendly outlets received exclusives, taped interviews, and access. The terms were rarely neutral. Interviews were conditioned on framing, on pre-approval of questions. Reporters who pursued less accommodating angles were effectively frozen out of access. In a business where access begets stories and friendships beget scoops, control over access becomes control over narrative. There are moral ambiguities that need to be stated clearly. Some of the actions taken in the wake of the allegations, gathering support from clergy, documenting philanthropy, producing controlled interviews, are legitimate public relations activities for any person accused of wrongdoing. They are standard crisis management. The question, however, is not whether they were standard, but whether they were deployed in a way that privileged image over truth, and whether that privilege was enabled by massive financial resources. The Chandler episode had another consequence. It revealed the playbook itself. Once tactics are visible: settlement, marriage, PR blitz, they can be replicated. That replication matters beyond one person. The same architecture of silence, legal containment, and narrative replacement can be used by others who find themselves under similar accusations. The Chandler settlement, partial as it is to a single case, became, in hindsight, a template. It is also important to recall the personal dimension. For the family who brought the complaint, the aftermath was not an abstract pattern. It was a life altered. Settlement can be a respite, but it can also be a shackle that prevents speaking and healing in public terms. Years later, interviews and fragments of testimony would re-emerge in books and documentaries. Some people spoke. Some remained silent. The human cost is punctuated by the legal architecture that made choices on their behalf. And yet the story did not end. The machinery, the question now is practical and urgent. How did institutions, not only lawyers and PR firms, but museums, film studios, and record companies, turn a messy, unresolved history into a consumable legacy? The next act shows how the myth was not merely restored, but deliberately manufactured, with tools that resemble the best techniques of modern politics. If you have ever watched a crisis unfold on television, you recognize the choreography, a statement, a sympathetic cutaway, a counter-narrative. What happened after 1993 was not improvisation so much as the implementation of a full-time industry, reputation rehabilitation. The machinery is familiar in white papers and public relations manuals, but its scale in this case was extraordinary. Sony and other corporate stakeholders were not moral arbiters. They were fiduciaries. Their job was to value assets and mitigate downside. Their calculus is simple to state and complicated in practice. Preserve the revenue stream, minimize legal exposure, and protect the brand. To do that, they deployed a suite of techniques that read like a campaign playbook. First, narrative displacement. The strategy was to move the public conversation away from allegations and toward persecution, frame the story as extortion, not misconduct. Internal memos, when exposed, spelled this out. Find sympathetic spokespeople, emphasize the accuser's potential for financial motivation, and cast doubt on motivated testimony. The tactic is not novel. It has been used across contested arenas. What matters here is the thoroughness with which it was applied. Second, the recruitment of moral authorities. Clergy, community leaders, and philanthropists were tapped to say simple things. I know his heart. He is devoted to children. This is a man of good works. These statements have rhetorical power precisely because they are not issued by publicists, but by trusted figures. But their public utterance was not accidental. Phone logs show outreach. Schedules show coordinated appearances designed to create a ring of moral iron around the subject. Third, the controlled interview. Television gave the world portraits in motion, but control is everything in a live medium. Interviews were negotiated down to the questions, the setting, the wardrobe. A favored interviewer would get a sit-down only after agreeing to preconditions. The effect is familiar. When a conversation is curated, the result is not discovery but confirmation. Viewers watch a man appear lucid and humane. The images become proof in the court of popular opinion. Fourth, the weaponization of charity. Philanthropy is double-edged. It can be genuine, and it can be strategic. In the months after allegations, charity events were staged and publicized. Hospital visits were filmed. Donations, while real, were timed and announced to counteract negative headlines. Images of the subjects surrounded by children became, in many places, the visual rebuttal to verbal accusations. The emotional weight of a child's smile is a powerful counterinstrument to factual claims. Fifth, media partnerships. The issue is not merely friendly coverage, but transactional access. Exclusive access was offered to outlets willing to provide context favorable to the subject. Critical outlets were denied. The result is an asymmetry of narratives, where opponents could be heard in one segment. The majority of the airtime featured supportive voices. The public consumes the curated set and assumes it is comprehensive. It is not. Sixth, legal intimidation. Lawyers issued letters, implied lawsuits, and used the threat of ruinous countersuits to deter aggressive reporting. In the ecosystem of journalism, legal budgets are uneven. A small outlet cannot easily fight a defamation suit from a high-powered firm. That imbalance shapes coverage. Stories that might have been aired in a less monetized environment are often suppressed or softened. Seventh, archival curation. The subject's estate and corporate partners gained control over footage, contracts, and documents. They decided when to release what. Posthumous productions were edited to highlight rehearsal footage, artistry, and dedication. Risky materials, medical records, questionable correspondences were withheld. The gatekeepers of archives became architects of memory. The cumulative effect of these measures is not merely damage control, it is memory engineering. A single good documentary can humanize. A decade of curated content can sanctify. Over time, the sanitized image becomes the default narrative available to future producers, educators, and fans. Consider the mechanisms of repetition. A rehearsal clip appears in an anniversary documentary. A laudatory biography is excerpted in a magazine. A museum exhibit places a glove behind glass with a plaque that speaks of genius. Each iteration polishes rough edges. Over years, the aggregate of such iterations forms a smooth surface that discourages deep inquiry. People learn the polished narrative because it is the easiest image to stream, click, license, and mourn. This process is also technological. Streaming platforms prioritize content that will attract clicks and subscriptions. A celebratory concert film is binge-friendly. A prosecutorial archive full of disputed testimony is not. Algorithms reward nostalgia. Corporations, guided by the same incentives, invest in the content that performs best. Commerce and memory thus feed one another. But there are costs beyond truth. The technique pioneered here, that of legal containment plus image manufacturing, becomes a playbook for other figures. The Chandler settlement, the PR blitz, the curated archives, they are not unique. They are an instruction manual. Firms observed the outcome and learned that monetary settlements, when combined with aggressive storytelling, can produce long-term reputational survival. That lesson echoes through later cases across entertainment and other sectors. This reshaping of public memory has societal consequences. Childhood protection norms become fuzzier when popular stories normalize special relationships. The argument that eccentric genius contains unconventional personal life becomes less a defense and more a permissive culture. Child safety advocates see danger. When celebrity becomes a shield, societal lines become blurred. A generation learns through entertainment what is acceptable behavior rather than through law or ethics. Legal scholars and cultural critics have debated whether the outcome of such cases creates a structural injustice. Is truth optional when money can buy silence? Is the public entitled to the full record when powerful entities control the narrative? These are not easy questions. They sit at the crossroads of privacy, contract law, and public interest. The answers vary by jurisdiction and by political will. There is a visual grammar to the propaganda machine. It favors warm lighting, soft focus, child laughter, charity plaques, and long takes that permit empathy. It hides the paperwork and the ledger entries. It displaces skepticism with ritual. And it institutionalizes a simple technique. Produce so many positive images that the negative ones become noise. Yet the machine also left traces. Not every document could be locked away. Not every witness could be silenced forever. Not every reporter could be intimidated. Over time, leaks, court filings, and investigative projects revealed fissures. Small revelations accumulated. They did not always produce immediate legal consequences, but they did chip at consensus. The myth remained, but it became more complicated for the attentive. So where does that leave the public and you as the viewer? It leaves you with the realization that the stories you consume are not neutral descriptions, but artifacts constructed by interests. They are persuasive in design. That does not mean every portrait is false. It means every portrait must be read with attention to who paid for it, who curated it, and what was omitted. After the construction of the public Michael, two things happened simultaneously. The market reclaimed certainty, it learned how to monetize a stable memory, and the culture learned how to forgive with an economy. This fusion produced a lucrative, enduring posthumous industry. Music catalogs, tours, tributes, branded merchandise. These are not merely commerce. They are the economic scaffolding of a memory that was meticulously crafted. Mini cliffhanger. After decades of careful manufacture, The image exists as a global product museum exhibits, theatrical productions, streaming playlists. But the archive still contains contradictions. Witnesses across decades, producers, choreographers, band members describe a young man who rehearsed in the obsessive way of someone seeking refuge in mastery. You can imagine the late-night studio, the single lamp over a mixer, the echo of a metronome, a pair of patent shoes tapping the same measure until the step becomes bone. That discipline-produced work the world still recognizes. Syncopations, camera moves, the marriage of sound and gesture that made music television a narrative form. Those are not minor feats. They are technical innovations executed with relentless focus. But the biography of a performing child also carries a cost. Multiple accounts, including admissions by family members, confirm that Michael's childhood training was accompanied by physical punishment and intense control. The consensus among biographers is that this upbringing left emotional scars, arrested development, a longing for approval, and the persistence of childlike emotional patterns into adulthood. Those psychological contours help explain why an adult would repeatedly seek the company of children, why the childlike persona could feel less like affectation and more like a refuge. This is not an excuse, far from it, but it is context that explains behavior without excusing harm. The question of his body is another axis where myth and record collide. Public narratives insisted for years that vitiligo and a handful of procedures explained every change. But medical testimonies, leaked correspondence, and photographic timelines show a more complex story. Numerous surgical interventions beginning earlier than the public was told, stylistic choices to alter racialized features, and a lifelong negotiation with identity and appearance. The Honest Portrait recognizes the reality of vitiligo while also acknowledging that cosmetic alteration became part of a broader project of self-fashioning. Image making was not incidental to his work. It was central to it, and, at times, destructive. Financial records complicate the image of a wealthy superstar living the good life. Court filings reveal a pattern that is now familiar in narratives about creative geniuses. A person generating enormous revenue, but repeatedly subject to exploitative contractual arrangements, spiraling debt, and mismanagement. Contracts, advances, and corporate structures funneled money into networks that insulated managers, labels, and investors more than the artist. Saying this is not an attempt to exculpate poor choices. It is an argument that the man who became a global brand was also entangled in systems that could hollow out his autonomy. Then there is the most contentious, morally charged aspect of the portrait, his relationships with children. Here the honest version refuses both the easy absolution and the simplified demonization. The public record includes allegations made in multiple cases. Some led to settlements, others did not. Investigators collected testimony, photographs, and clinical notes. Later accounts and interviews added detail and contradiction. Crucially, criminal convictions did not follow the most prominent accusations, but neither did the settlements often structured and negotiated by insurers and legal teams erase the fact of serious allegations and the pain described by accusers. The sober reading, a pattern of behavior that, at minimum, normalized intimacy with minors and, at worst, crossed boundaries that society typically protects with law and custom. That pattern cannot be reduced to a single cause. It is the product of personality, trauma, enabling networks, and the permissive bubble of celebrity. What about the defenders, the friends, the clergy, the charities? The honest portrait must incorporate them, too. Many testified to acts of kindness, to generosity, and to moments of sincere affection. Foundations and philanthropic work are part of his ledger. Hospitals, donations, and public campaigns were real and had effects. But those acts occurred alongside strategic uses of charity, timed announcements, photo opportunities, and events arranged in the wake of negative press. The presence of genuine good deeds does not cancel wrongdoing. It complicates the moral calculus and forces observers to hold both reality's generosity and manipulation in tension. One important feature of this portrait is the role of enablers. Not everyone around him was a villain. Many were careerists, loyal friends, fearful employees, or parents seeking better futures for their children. The dynamic, when examined closely, often looks like a marketplace of favors. Access traded for gifts, proximity converted into opportunities, silence purchased with payment or threatened litigation. These are familiar human transactions given an extraordinary setting. A billionaire ecosystem where conventional boundaries blurred under celebrity. The moral question then becomes not only about a single individual's culpability, but about a social arrangement that permitted and even incentivized risk. It is essential to separate what is established by record from what remains contested. Medical records, for instance, document the existence of vitiligo. Photographs and surgical bills indicate multiple cosmetic operations. Legal filings and bank statements reveal settlements and patterns of cash flow. Investigative memos and police notes record interviews and physical evidence. What becomes disputed is the interpretation. Do settlements indicate guilt or risk management? Do charitable acts demonstrate character or image strategy? The honest portrait points out the data, acknowledges the gray areas, and refuses to collapse nuance into rhetorical certainty. Another dimension often elided in shorthand accounts is race. Public imagery presented Michael in ways that complicated and often contradicted his relationship to blackness. On stage, he was a black performer who transformed pop music and elevated black performance into mainstream spectacle. Offstage, private choices and cosmetic procedures suggested an ambivalence or rejection of racial markers. To understand that tension, imagine the stage as a theater of aspiration and the private surgical table as a theater of erasure. Both stages mattered. They reveal a man who both drew power from his black identity and also, in intimate ways, sought to alter the features that tethered him to it. That contradiction sits at the heart of his cultural significance and the discomfort he provoked. So what can we say about accountability in an honest portrait? It is a complicated answer. The criminal justice system, for various reasons from the disappearance of witnesses to the tactical use of settlements and the practical limits of prosecutors, did not deliver a final legal reckoning in the Chandler case. That absence did not, however, function as an ethical exoneration. Financial settlements, by their nature, close public processes, they do not establish truth under oath. The honest view insists that the absence of conviction is not equivalent to innocence, particularly when there is a pattern of concerning behavior corroborated across sources. It demands that we treat legal outcomes as part of the picture, not the whole. There are human stories within this composite that deserve attention. Survivors and accusers carry private pain that a public settlement can never erase. Former aides and friends recount both tender and terrifying moments. They remember songs and surgeries, lullabies and threats. Those memories are uneven, often contradictory, and always partial, but they are indispensable. In a just account, we listen to them, weigh them against corroborating evidence, and avoid simplifying them into propaganda on either side. Finally, the honest portrait acknowledges complicity at scale. The recording industry, corporate partners, PR firms, and media institutions all participated in preserving a marketable image. They had incentives, catalogs, tours, streams, and licensing deals that represented tens or hundreds of millions in revenue. When corporations and institutions choose profit over precaution, they participate in a moral calculus that matters. The individual, problematic as he may have been, did not act in a vacuum. He acted inside a network that enabled concealment, rewarded spectacle, and normalized exceptions for the exceptionally profitable. If you look at this portrait and feel unsettled, that reaction is the point. The human mind prefers stories with clean arcs rise, fall, redemption. Real lives are messy, eh? The honest image of Michael Jackson is not a comfort. It is an invitation to reckon with how brilliance and to understand the present, you must map that operation. Begin with the archives. Film and tape are not raw truth. They are material under control. After the scandals, executives and the estate tightened access to unreleased footage, outtakes, rehearsal clips, and private recordings. Footage that showed fatigue, aging, or disorientation was shelved. Sequences that exhibited charm, wit, or technical mastery were polished and repackaged. A rehearsal becomes revelation when edited into a montage. A shaky off moment becomes a rare behind-the-scenes pleasure when framed as intimacy. Archival managers acted as curators with balance sheets. Every clip cleared or locked was a decision about memory. Next, consider institutions, museums, theaters, and educational programs that opted to participate in the rewriting. Exhibits displayed iconic costumes under soft lighting with plaques that emphasized creativity and humanitarianism, not controversy. Schools and cultural organizations used sanitized images in curricula, celebrating innovation while omitting the Messier contexts. These choices are not neutral. They determine what is taught to new generations, what images appear in history books, and which narratives circulate in classrooms. The past is thus not merely remembered, it is manufactured. Then there were the media partnerships. Strategic exclusives appeared in friendly outlets. Long-form specials were negotiated to present the subject as misunderstood genius. Interviews with sympathetic interlocutors, clergy, childhood friends, celebrity allies circulated in prime time. Critical reporters found themselves out of favor, denied access, or threatened with litigation. Media functioning as a market does not treat truth as an absolute. It treats narratives as products. When access is contingent on favorable coverage, the incentive structure skews reportage toward the consumable. Philanthropy became a tool of reputation. Hospital visits, charity galas, and scholarship foundations were not only acts of generosity, they were public relations instruments. The imagery is easy to imagine. Warm lighting, soft focus, a child laughing in a photograph. Those images are powerful because they operate symbolically. They replace questions with effect. Seeing a beloved figure comforting a child produces an emotional counterweight to disturbing claims. The technique is not unique to any single individual. It is a known tactic in crisis management. What made it effective in this case was scale simultaneous events, constant repetition, and corporate amplification. Corporate incentives mattered more than moral logic. Record companies, film studios, and licensing partners calculated risk and return. Files show advertising plans timed to anniversaries, rights negotiations that prioritized profitable retrospectives, and merchandising strategies that transformed grief into sales. The economic model turned memory into revenue. Anniversary editions, tribute concerts, branded apparel, museum exhibitions, streaming specials. Each product reintroduced a curated image into the marketplace, reinforcing a particular interpretation of a life. Technology altered the tempo and reach of the rehabilitation. Algorithms on streaming platforms favored content that generated clicks and watch time. Nostalgic concert films and upbeat documentaries performed far better than contentious investigative pieces. Platforms optimized for engagement were instrumentally friendly to polished, emotionally resonant content. Corporate owners of catalogs and rights understood the algorithmic advantages and invested accordingly. The circulation of sanitized content became both a business strategy and a structural advantage. There was also the institutionalization of silence. Settlements with confidentiality clauses closed conversations. Legal teams used the threat of costly defamation suits to deter critical inquiry. For smaller outlets and independent journalists, the calculus was simple: pursue the story and risk financial ruin, or decline access and remain in business. The chilling effect limited the variety of narratives entering public discourse. When the range of permissible stories narrows, public memory becomes flatter and more uniform. Yet, even an impressive campaign leaves traces. Over time, small documents leak. Redacted memos surface. Former employees, freed by distance from power, provide inconsistent but illuminating recollections. Investigative journalists piece together timelines from court filings, travel logs, and bank transfers. These fissures do not always lead to dramatic legal consequences, but they complicate the tidy story. The sanitized narrative, once nearly hegemonic, began to look patchwork. For attentive consumers, the glossy illusions frayed at the edges. The cultural consequences are broader than one biography. The techniques measured here: legal containment, media management, philanthropic reframing, archive curation, became available to others. The case institutionalized a playbook: settle quietly, flood sympathetic channels with positive imagery, and lock archives. That pattern metastasized. Decades later, similar strategies would be visible in other scandals across entertainment and beyond. The consequence is structural. A template that privileges those with capital over those without, creating asymmetries in how public claims are adjudicated. Beyond mechanism and industry is the matter of social norms. The sanitized portrait normalized certain allowances. The public learned to accommodate eccentricities in the name of genius. Charismatic performative behavior received cultural cover. Adults who sought intimate friendships with children could point to public images and argue for the innocence of similar relationships. This was not merely the product of a single individual's charisma. It was a cultural shift shaped by imagery and narrative. Experts in child protection argue that this normalization shifted thresholds of suspicion and made it harder for families and institutions to detect or respond to risk. Consider, too, the educational landscape. Museums and theater productions favor the celebratory elements of a life because celebratory content is marketable and least likely to attract legal scrutiny. University courses on popular culture may reference a sanitized film clip rather than the court filings. Textbooks excerpt triumphant reviews rather than investigative reports. Over time, the curated narrative ossifies into a default history easy to teach, comforting for audiences, profitable for institutions. Economics plays a decisive role in perpetuation. The estate and corporate owners of his brand continue to profit handsomely. Streaming royalties, catalog sales, tribute tours, theatrical adaptations, and memorabilia generate revenue that feeds back into institutions inclined to preserve the profitable narrative. Money buys not just access, but structural inertia. Once an ecosystem of stakeholders depends on a particular version of the past, it will resist changes that threaten income streams. At the same time, the survivability of myth depends on repetition and poetic simplicity. A rehearsal montage in a glossy documentary, repeated across platforms, becomes shorthand for genius. A glove behind glass, lit solemnly in a museum, becomes a relic rather than an artifact. The human cognitive bias towards simplified stories does the rest. The more a sanitized image circulates, the harder it becomes to dislodge for casual viewers. The archive functions like a palimpsest. The older, complicated text is scraped away and overwritten with a clearer, sellable script. But cultural manufacture is never total. For some audiences, the contradictions never fully evaporated. Investigative pieces, memoirs by survivors, and independent documentaries created counter-narratives that gained traction among new generations. Social media allowed survivors and skeptics to bypass gatekeepers. Platforms like YouTube hosted long-form criticisms that engaged millions. Over time, the monolith softened. The sanitized narrative remained powerful for many, but a more contested public memory emerged for those willing to look deeper. What remains visible today is a hybrid legacy. On one shelf sits the gold record, on another sit accusations, court filings, and testimonials. The popular image music, iconic moves, costumes competes with a darker set of associations. The two coexist uneasily in public life. If you stayed with this investigation to the end, thank you. If this episode matters to you, subscribe. We are building a small channel that intends to open more files, challenge convenient myths, and tell the stories the classroom omitted. Leave a comment with your city or country and one thing this video made you question. Your responses help map where people still want to learn the whole story. There are other dossiers waiting to be opened, and the work of remembering honestly is only starting.